So welcome again, everybody. My name is Elizabeth Toh, and I am the Senior Manager of Sustainability and Accounting at A4S. Thank you for joining our webinar today, which is about Lead the Way, Engaging the Board and Executive Management. Please note that we are recording the webinar for others, and it will be made available on the A4S YouTube channel afterwards. These A4S Academy monthly webinars are open to both Academy and non-Academy participants, so all are very welcome. So let's take a look at today's agenda. I'll be doing a quick introduction to the topic before we move on to a panel discussion, and there will be time for Q&A with the audience at the end. But do feel free to ask questions in the chat function throughout the webinar. And let's take a look at the learning objectives. So after completing the webinar, you will be able to describe the practical steps for engaging the board and executive management on sustainability. You'll also be able to outline how to prepare for engaging the board through regular board activities and embed into regular decision making. And you'll be hearing from a lot of our panelists will have good experience and learnings to share, so you'll be able to translate those into your work as well. So now I would like to introduce our speaker today. We are very pleased to have Robin Stalker, who is former CFO of adidas AG and currently Supervisory Board member of Hugo Boss, Commerzbank, Schaeffler and Schmitz Cargobull in Germany. So Robin will be sharing his reflections on the topic as a former CFO and as a board member across these diverse sectors. We also have Julian Stewart. Hopefully he can join us. He's financial controller of Watercare Services Limited in Auckland in New Zealand. It's 5 a.m. over there, so hopefully he'll be joining us in a moment. Watercare has contributed a case study to the A4S Essential Guide to Engaging the Board in Executive Management, which we are developing at the moment. And Julian will be sharing about the approach to engaging the board at Watercare and some of the practical steps to get started. You'll also be hearing from Davinder Valeri, our director of the A4S Canadian chapter, who will share her perspective from working with our Canadian member companies on this subject. And Helen Slinger, our executive director at A4S, and myself will be facilitating this webinar. So let's find out a bit about you who are in the audience. I'll just run a few poll questions now. If you could take a moment to complete them as they come up on your screen. So the first question, which department are you from? Okay, so most of you are from finance, but we also have some from sustainability, strategy, and others. That's great. Second question is, to what extent is your board and executive management engaged on environmental and social issues? Okay, so a range of responses, and you'll be hearing from our panelists later about what an engaged board looks like, so that should be interesting for you. And then just one last question. So in your role, to what extent can you support and influence the board and executive management to adopt a sustainable business model that delivers sustainable outcomes? Okay, again, a range of responses, but hopefully, from the panel later, you'll be able to hear the experience of finance teams and CFOs, and then you'll be able to take some of the learnings away and apply it in your role. So thank you very much for taking part in the polls. So now I'll just spend a few minutes to introduce you to the topic before we move to the panel. So why are we here today to talk about engaging the board in executive management on sustainability? Why is it important? Well, we know that the board and executive management are responsible for ensuring the long-term viability of a company and also to address the interests of its stakeholders as well. And with climate change and other pressing environmental and social issues, as well as a global pandemic happening, the business case for a shift towards a more resilient business model and a sustainable economy is getting stronger. And it is important for the board and executives to set the tone at the top and define a clear strategy for implementation. And we also see that regulators and policymakers are progressively bringing the disclosure and fiduciary duty of companies on these issues to the forefront. So that means that the board and executive management are under more pressure to approach the governance and management of sustainability the same way as they would with any other business matters. So it is really important to have an engaged board and executive management where sustainability issues are not only being discussed, but embedded into their regular decision making. And many of you in the audience today are from finance. So why is this topic relevant to finance, and what role does finance play? Well, we see that finance can be a sustainable business enabler or accelerator. The CFO and finance team, they have a decisive influence over financial and business decisions that can help create a more resilient, accountable, and profitable organizations. And many times they are considered by the board as trusted business partner advisor. So really by leveraging the regular board activities and building on existing communication channels and relationships, finance can really start to engage the board on sustainability. And as I mentioned before, we are developing an A4S essential guide on this topic. And in the guide, we set out 3 key steps to engaging the board in executive management. And step 1, starting with prepare, which is about understanding what sustainability means for the organization, assessing the board culture, which looks at governance, competencies, composition, and behaviors of the board members, and also assessing whether the leaders of the organization, so looking across the executive management team to see whether they are aligned on embedding sustainability throughout the organization. And stage 2, engage. So this is about, first of all, getting buy-in and support from executive management team. So in our A4S CFO leadership network, we see that in some of our member companies, the CFO is the sustainability champion. And he or she in turn plays a key role in bringing other executive members along. And working with the company secretary as well is really important before engaging the board through regular board activities. And finance can contribute a lot to this engagement process by utilizing its finance skills and expertise. And finally, the last step, embed. So engaging the board is not a one-off exercise. It is about embedding environmental and social considerations into regular board decision-making over time. And this may involve changes to internal structures and processes, which again, finance has a key role to play. So let's hear from our speakers now about their experience and insights into this subject. So I'll pass the time over to Helen.
Thanks, Elizabeth. And it looks unfortunately like Julian, our third speaker, has been unable to join us. As it's 5 a.m. with him in New Zealand, I fear he may have had alarm clock trouble. But welcome, Robin. Welcome, Davinder. Thank you very much for joining us. It's great to have you here today.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Excellent. Thank you.
I'd like to spend a little bit of time with you hearing from your own experiences, really, to help our audience to think about what they may be able to do in this space and what similar actions they may be taking, that they may have the opportunity to take, learning from your insights. So Robin, maybe let's start with you. So as Elizabeth introduced, you were formerly a CFO at Adidas. And I'm interested to hear, what role did you play in engaging the other executives and the board on environmental and social issues?
So I think I have to acknowledge firstly that obviously at that stage I had colleagues who were also very receptive to this. I mean, it wasn't as if it was a completely foreign topic for everyone at the board level. But I think the first thing is to understand that one needs to appreciate that the whole aspects of climate change or environmental and social responsibility are really good business factors. And so you can normally gain the attention of your colleagues by simply making that clear to them, that basically that is to be a market leader or to be attractive to consumers in the future. We need to get a handle on this and we need to be good at what we're doing here. With Adidas in those days, it was very clear that the finance function, which obviously is throughout the whole organization, was responsible for preparing all the decision making. And so in decision making, you make choices. And you make those choices at all sorts of levels, not just at the board level, obviously, you make it at all the levels. And so one of the things that we introduced was something that I called integrated performance management. And integrated performance management at that stage was to attempt to recognize that, and Elizabeth referred to stakeholder responsibility a little bit, but it was an attempt to recognize that it's not just about deciding which alternative or which scenario generates short-term the most money or most profit. It really is about other factors as well that hopefully will over time mean that you're generating more profit in the longer term view. And so the four things we focused on were obviously the financials of whatever the decision was that we were taking, but secondly also, what would this decision or this scenario have as an impact on our consumers? And we tracked that with Net Promoter Score. Thirdly, what do we think the alternatives here or the decision we're taking would have as an impact on our employees? For us, employee engagement was something extremely important also. We tried to measure that. And fourthly, what would this decision have as an impact on our environmental footprint? And we were trying to, at that stage, build up, obviously, enough data to be able to make at least the information or the factors more transparent to the decision maker. We didn't try, as fine as to say, here, this is how you should decide. The attempt was purely to make the decision maker more aware of the choices and the impact of the choices that they have on those four factors. And I think that really helped focus not just the board level, but all the decision makers on the impacts here. And we regularly then brought that together into the major decisions that we obviously had to take at a board level. And I am a fan of, or I believe in the concept that the chief financial officer is really the chief value creation officer. And that in the board context, I think really helps not just to point out the risks when we don't do something in terms of environment or social impact, but also the opportunities, the value that we're creating should we do this better. And I think to get back to my first point, at the end of the day, if we can present that in a transparent way, that this will mean that it's good business over the longer term, then I think you can get good buy-in, and certainly I got good buy-in at Adidas for that.
Fantastic. And that chief value creation officer is a role that we keep hearing more about, or the chief value officer. I wonder if we'll be seeing those in executive management teams more frequently in the future. So now, of course, you sit across the other side of the board table, and you're in the non-executive side on the supervisory board. So, and you have good visibility across, a range of different sectors. What different perspective does that give you?
Well, I think that's very clear that we've made tremendous progress over the last 2 to 3 years. I mean, there were, depending on the industry that you're in, a natural interest in environmental matters for years, obviously, part of the business. But I think it's fair to say that a lot of organizations have also tended to treat the new requirements for environmental and social reporting more as a reporting requirement rather than a business decision-making requirement. And I think that we're seeing changing considerably. It's changing because obviously the regulator or the governments are starting to put clearer requirements onto that in terms of at least reporting. If you're going to report, you better get the information so that you can report. But also, and this I think is fundamental, because we're seeing customers and also our talent, our employees, are also requiring more information on this. And I'll take the customer one and say, very clear example in many companies now, because investors or because the regulator is requiring certain information, then they are pushing that requirement down through the various suppliers or the business partners to also provide more transparency in that. And I think that has been a fundamental positive for concentrating the mind of those executives that perhaps did not to date treat it as a business matter. And that then also in turn means that it opens the door for that conversation about, well, how do we then differentiate ourselves from this? Because if you take the risk point and talking about the responsibilities that boards have, the liability issues as well, but also the responsibility in terms of governance, we need to understand what are the risks involved in these matters, and hopefully also then what are the opportunities here. And so I think it has definitely become easier to take people by the hand now in the boards and help them understand what they can do, not just because what they have to do, but what they can do to make sure that they can maintain a market-leading position also in this factor.
Fantastic. Thank you, Robin. And as if by magic, I see that Julian has been able to join us. Perfect timing, Julian. And thank you very much for getting up so early to be with us today. It looks a little bit from your background like you're actually halfway on your way to the UK, and maybe on a plane up in the stars. Remember those aeroplanes? Wow. So Julian, thank you very much for being here today.
My pleasure, and apologies. I'm operating out of a new office at home, and yeah, the connection was working fine yesterday, and for some reason it just didn't want to start up. I think it was my broadband was still asleep, unfortunately.
Don't worry, we're used to these technical hitches now. So Julian, in terms of your organisation, I believe you have adopted an integrated approach to decision making for a few years now, and as the financial controller, you've had quite a significant role in this transition. Maybe you could share a little bit with us about that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, yeah, I guess my role was to actually get the initiative off the ground. I still remember back in 2007 being called into my CFO's office, basically saying, I've got a little job for you to do, and those was his words. I don't think he fully understood pretty much the magnitude of the job that sort of lay ahead, but he wanted me to sort of have a look at putting together a project team to deliver our company's first integrated report at the end of that financial year. So to be perfectly honest, I hadn't heard of integrated reporting at that time. So I had to go away and look up the framework, do some research, look out within New Zealand to see if there were any other corporates that adopted the framework into their reporting. And I had found two at the stage. There were a couple of early front runners, two very different companies. One was New Zealand Post, and then the other one was one of our largest fisheries company called Sanford. I then had to work out who would be best suited to be in our sort of project steering team. We needed some good representation across the organisation. So we ended up with a team that included one of our key communications people, had our governance manager, and we also had our head of sustainability as well. So I think we had a good skills cross section of skills to get it off the ground. Yeah. I had to. I think also thought because it's pretty new to New Zealand, and pretty much most people I spoke to in the organisation hadn't really heard about it. I looked did some more research, and we actually employed some external expertise as well. So we got someone who was effectively our integrated reporting coach, luckily for us, he was a person who was involved in setting up the framework in the first instance, and he was fantastic. He was important for helping get that buy-in early on, because he had that credibility. He understood the framework inside and out, And he was also great at running workshops to sort of, not just our board, but our executive management and then some of our senior leaders, trying to, get them on that journey about as to what integrated reporting is all about. And he was, and where his real value came in was at the end to do a lot of the Q&A-ing of our first drafts of our integrated reports. So just sort of say, look, you don't need this information, you don't need this information. Why are you putting this in here? Where's the real value in it? So it was quite brutal, but very necessary. And we also used an external consultant, because another, I guess, a key part of putting together a good integrated report is that you sort of nail down the key material issues, and you engage with the right stakeholders. So I was lucky enough again to find someone who was a bit of an expert in this area, and who was able to engage our key stakeholders both externally and internally, and actually really get them to talk as well. So that was one of the skills that she had, because quite often you might have a group of your stakeholders who probably don't like to engage as much and not necessarily as forthcoming with their views, but she was able to unearth a whole range of different viewpoints that we didn't even knew existed. And then from there on in, I was, I guess the lead point with the board, particularly because I attend board meetings frequently, but to give an update to the board as well about progress and what the next steps were and where we're going to involve them in the process as well.
Yeah, so I mean, obviously getting the board involved in that was really important. So were there any, the challenges that you faced along the way in bringing the board into that discussion and getting them to accept this approach?
Yeah, there are definitely challenges, absolutely, because as with any board, you're going to have a mixed range of viewpoints and experiences, and which is what you want on any board. But we were lucky though that we had a champion on our board who was one of the senior members, and she had gone through this whole process with New Zealand Post, and she happened to be on the same board. And she was one of the key drivers to get this off the ground in the first place. I think she pretty much tapped my CFO on the shoulder and said, "Hey, look, this is something I really want us to as a organisation, to focus on." So having that voice already on the board was very powerful. So whenever I'm giving an update and I have two or three blank looking faces staring back at me, she was able to sort of pick up on that and then add more colour to it, and then also draw on her experiences from going through it with New Zealand Post. But there were certainly challenges. I mean, it's just you're asking the directors to move more into an uncomfortable zone in terms of what we intend to report. It's breaking down that sort of mindset that the finance capital isn't the most capital anymore. It's important, but it's got to be considered in the context of the other capitals that we need to consider. And it's also getting them to be a bit braver, to look ahead into the future more. So, and being upfront with what our risks are, and being happy to report on what our risks are in the medium and long term. So that put them in a bit of an uncomfortable position to start with. And it's also that other change that comes with integrated reporting is that you've got to be comfortable. Everyone's comfortable to talk about all the highlights and how well we did in this last financial year, but it's also being honest and transparent and putting up right next to it where we didn't get it right. And that can be a little bit of a mind shift for them to be comfortable in doing that. It certainly was. It certainly had its moments, and it also takes some time just to understand why we're doing it in the first place. But the key thing to get that sort of buy-in, I felt, was you bring in good examples, and quite often they're actually have been using the principles, and using integrated thinking in the past with some key strategic decision making. So if you can actually bring some colour to that and actually say, well, you're actually using it now, but you're not actually aware of it. It is that, again, that's quite a powerful way to get them to understand what that framework's all about and what integrated thinking is all about.
Great. So it does sound like having a champion on your board, though, was quite helpful along the way, which is
very
good
much,
to hear.
very much so.
Good. And Davinder, coming to you then. Now you've been working on a project exactly on this subject, so engaging boards and executive management with some of the A4S Canadian members. Maybe you can share a couple of examples of what those members are doing to engage the board on sustainability.
Thanks so much, Helen. And it's great to hear both Julian and Robin speak. And it alludes to the fact that CFOs are they're a key player in the organization, and they're part of the executive management team. And most often, as we've heard, they have direct engagement with the board, and they're involved in that regular board activities that we are hearing about. But not just on the financial matter side, but also for governance, strategy, risk, business performance, and investment. So the CFO and his team, they basically have the ear of the board. And this is a great way for them to open the door to the board to introduce sustainability. But recognizing that organizations have different experiences, they're in different stages of their sustainability journey. And the process to engage the board is not necessarily a linear platform. And the connection points of sustainability pillars of governance, society, and economics is sometimes difficult to make. So in this guide, you're right, Helen, you'll see examples, Canadian examples, and others that showcase the journey that these organizations have gone through. And for Brookfield Asset Management, one of the case studies, their example was that they needed to issue a green bond, but they needed to get board support. So again, they needed to get the board engaged. And this was back in 2017, and similar to what Julian's saying, some aspects of ESG were in play, but it was still a new concept. A lot of folks didn't know about it. And so Brookfield, they had to get the board excited. They had to get them interested, and they needed to make sustainability a part of the agenda. Basically, they needed to get the board engaged, to ask for more, want more, and be interested to keep asking additional questions. So Brookfield presented the green bond as an opportunity for future growth, a future value, linking it to their renewable business, but showcasing the benefits or the opportunity that this could bring to the organization. So the CFO and the finance team, one of the things that they did right away was they needed to make sure they understood what is a green bond. They educated themselves, they educated the board to some degree. They prepared a draft mock-up or a framework to work out any of the kinks. They anticipated any issues that might be faced by the organization. So basically giving the executives and the board a bit of a comfort feel, removing the unknown, removing the fear, getting the board to be a bit more understanding and engaged, helping basically pave a path on how sustainability could be embedded into their decision making. Basically, how could they bring on board the green bond? So that's what Brookfield did. But same for the other case studies like Manulife and TELUS and even OMERS. It wasn't about sustainability as a separate item that had to go to the board. It was about embedding it into their everyday business and showing the long-term value to the business. And back to what Robin was saying about the CFO became the chief value officer all of a sudden, trying to say, here's this thing that's coming our way, but how does it really impact our business, our day-to-day operations? And today, for the Brookfield example, their board and their executives remain committed to advancing that funding strategy. They're very well aligned with sustainable business fundamentals. They understand where we are right now with ESG. So that path that they paved and the time they took to showcase what sustainability means for the organization really paid off for them. And you'll see that in these worked examples in the case studies.
Great, thank you. Thank you. We're going to go to our audience again, and we're going to come back to the panel shortly. And we're going to just ask a couple of poll questions. So just to get a little bit of a sense of what you've taken away from what you've heard so far, reflecting on that. So what can finance do to engage the board on sustainability through regular board activities? So some of these you may have heard from our panel already, some maybe from your own experience. Give you a couple of seconds to send those answers in. Still all coming in. Okay, great. So all of these areas are covered actually in our Engaging the Board and Executive Management Guide that will be coming out shortly. And I see that there's been a variety of answers on here, but the most popular one is understanding how sustainability can be embedded into these activities. So everybody's got a real sense of that from the discussion so far. If I could ask you a very similar question again, but those same 5 areas, but also just thinking about actually which of these areas do you, our audience, anticipate being the most challenging? So if you to go about this yourself, which feels hard? Okay, great, thank you. So it looks like the 2 that people feel might be the most difficult is understanding how sustainability can be embedded into the finance activities and the board activities, and planning how to embed sustainability into regular board decision making over time. So those are probably the 2 that people are finding expect to be most challenging. So with that in mind, maybe if I could come to our panel, do any of you have experience that responds to either of those 2 challenges? That we can hear from you now and offer some words of wisdom to our audience.
Well, I think the point about good business, making sure that your colleagues understand that this is not a nice to have. This is a fundamental part of whether your business is going to be successful in the future, whether you're going to be competitive in the future, whether your customers are going to want to go to you, whether you can attract the talent. And I accept that it's not immediately obvious how one makes everybody aware of that, but I think that what we're seeing now is that the market leaders are already doing this, and I think that tends to concentrate the mind of most people, so I think it is important that we make our colleagues aware that this is not just a nice to have or a reporting issue. This is really fundamental to our business.
Great. Julian, Davinder, anything to add?
Yeah, I completely agree with Robin, and it is something. I mean, it's from a New Zealand perspective, it's easy sort of to sort of encourage my colleagues to take on the principles, particularly in areas where they're trying to get things like business cases over the line, or in the case of supply chain, who are they're putting together procurement plans, and sort of sitting down and talking through them about how they can structure those in the context of sustainability, but also our capitals. You can actually do some really quite constructive whiteboard sessions as a consequence, and doing something like that, the actual business case in terms of the justification can almost write itself. But and it's also the fact that you tell them that this is what the board's expecting now as well. So I mean, you've got the soft approach, and then you've got the more the hammer approach to say that at the end of the day, you've got a better chance if something is going to the board for their decision, or up to the CFO, or up to the chief executive, you've got more chance of your paper getting approval if you can clearly demonstrate it's not just the financial capital that is the most important consideration. You've actually considered the impact on our other capitals, which as an organisation we all hold on an equal footing, and at the same time you're clearly able to show the interrelationship and trade-offs between them at the same time. And I know that sort of spending time with the supply chain team, they've really, I can see that now in the way they approach their procurements going forward, and they've recently put together their new 3-year procurement strategy. Mm-hmm. You can see integrated reporting and thinking embedded within that as well.
Great, thank you. So Elizabeth's just to put a call out to questions from the audience. I'm going to ask a couple more, and then we'll ask any that crop up from people listening today. Robin, maybe coming back to you. So there's a couple of challenges there that came out of that poll. Are there any other challenges that you see in engaging the board on sustainability? I guess both from your experience as a CFO or as a board member.
Look, I think the first and fundamental challenge is why us? I mean, you're asking us to maybe make transparent something that we have not yet made transparent. And what will this mean? Will our competitors see something in this? Can we even get the data? And I think that's a fundamental, and Julian was referring a little bit to this earlier in terms of a lot of the decision making that we're taking previously may have been a lot of from the gut decision making. We take into consideration what would this have as an impact on the other stakeholders. We think about that perhaps, but we never had any data for this. And so we've made those decisions. Now the objective is to try and formalize that, or at least try and professionalize that in providing more data to help or improve the quality of those decisions. But finding that data, I think that is a massive challenge because we've been used to tracking and reporting on financial data. And there's a whole range of non-financial data that we need now to track and understand and make decisions on. And in fact, I say non-financial data, but what I really mean is because I actually think, well, it's all financial data at the end. It's just pre-financial data at the moment. It will turn into financial data at some stage if your horizon's long enough. But we don't have that data necessarily in all of our organizations, and we need to get that. We need to also make our board colleagues comfortable that there is integrity in that data. And Julian said it earlier in terms of we're going to now be publishing something that may not always be positive. We might have KPIs that we're publishing that go the wrong way. And our board needs to understand what the implications of that are, and they need to be comfortable in agreeing to that. And I think that is also, again, I know I'm probably an unfair fan of CFOs and the finance team generally, but I really believe this is a fundamental role of finance. And that's why we in finance should be doing this, because we're the guys that provide the reliable, neutral data. It is trustworthy. It's been in some way tested. It has some integrity. And that we now need to do for these other pre-financial data. And I think that I would say is one of the most fundamental problems to overcome in discussions with boards that may actually have understood that, we need to be doing something with this, but it's a question of, okay, but really, what does this mean? What are the impacts of this? And how do we get this data? And how do we make sure that we don't have egg in our face in a year's time when we're presenting something that now turns out to be more negative than we thought it would be?
Yeah, and it is a challenge that we come across a lot. So despite the challenges then, it'd be good to get a sense of, why it's worth it. Have you got examples of where the board has made decisions that, maybe had they looked just historically just at financial information, they may have made a different decision, but now with wider data sets, more information, they've made a decision that, to use Julian's words, incorporates the other capitals?
Yeah, I think there are lots of specific examples, but I think I'll take two to sort of try and answer this. Firstly, and I have to go back to the adidas environment. In the integrated performance management methodology that we used, it helped us be clearer on the trade-offs of certain things that we were having to decide on in any case. For instance, do you use the traditional transport method for product from Asia into Europe or into the States per ship, or do you use air freight? And there are various factors that you need to take into consideration, that one of which is obviously the environmental impact, but it's also what is the pricing that you can get if you're quicker to market. So it's not a given, and trying to make those things more transparent, I think really helped make better decisions. We did not say, as I said at the beginning, we did not say you have to decide for the environmentally most friendly one, but it made managers more aware of the trade-offs that they're taking in that one. And the second one, I think, which has survived, and you can see that companies still doing a lot more in this area, is the whole concept of changing the materials from all of the synthetics to at least recycled synthetics or better cotton, but also here the initiative with Parley for the Oceans, taking plastic out of the oceans, recycling, an incredibly expensive process, making the product that was produced from this much, much more expensive. But in the context of everything that management was trying to do at that stage in terms of identifying the complete business impact, and what that has is an impact on our consumers, employees, and other stakeholders, I think has helped make decisions in this area.
Great, thank you. We don't have any questions from the audience yet, so I'll maybe keep going. So Davinder, I mean, given the audience that we have today is mainly from a finance background, and drawing on what you have seen with the Canadian members, you know, what are your top tips for finance teams to start engaging the board and executive management on sustainability?
Thanks, Helen. And I guess when we were putting this this guide together, or the case studies, a lot of even what Robin is saying and Julian's saying centered around the board itself, you know, making sure we understood what the board culture is. And that's really around how much knowledge does the board have, what's the composition of the board, and perhaps even are there any champions on the board that could be very, you know, supportive of the initiative of sustainability. That always is, I think, a key. But also one tidbit I would give is that organizations need to take stock of what they are actually doing, because you might find that different parts of the organization are doing different pieces on sustainability, where I think it's worthwhile taking stock or inventory of what is being done, what's being planned to be done, and then find that alignment amongst the leaders in the organization on how you want to embed sustainability. And that would really help making sure when you go to the board, you're actually taking a common message along, and someone else isn't showing up to the board with a different initiative that is still part of sustainability. I would also say, you know, keep it simple. The information that you are collecting, distill it down, distill it so that it is you know, digestible, that you can that the board can understand, like, what is it that you're talking about when you say sustainability, the definition of it, do they understand what it is that you're talking about? And also, again, what does it mean to your organization, and how does it link to your business model and your business purpose? You know, find some proof points in the organization. Another piece I'd add maybe here is also see what external parties are thinking about your organization with respect to sustainability. Do they see you in a certain light? And someone talked about, you know, the competitive nature. I think there's an opportunity here to understand, like, what are your peers doing? Like, what are others, what are their roles? What's their role? Are you a leader in this space? Do you want to be a leader? Are there others that are already leaders? And then disclosure, right? And I know we talked about this. Sometimes that disclosure piece kind of drives you down a certain path, but I think it's important to know, well, how does it eventually fit into that disclosure? Because yes, you're going to bring it into your decision making, but I think that piece is also important to know disclosure. Governance, strong governance, and we're good at that as financial leaders. You know, and you need to know what kind of governance do you have in the organization. How often are you meeting with the board? Do you have committees that could be talking about sustainability across the organization? And you know, an example for us on TELUS, when you read their case study, their CFO and their finance team, they were all of a sudden now responsible for finance and sustainability. So they were able to align those two pieces nicely, and they were able to understand or figure out how to put it into their strategic planning, how to put it into their budgeting, into their case analysis. But before they were able to do that, one piece I like to add is that I think education is a big part of this conversation. And for TELUS, one thing that they did, and some of the other case studies did the same thing, is finance teams, they paused and they started to educate themselves. They needed to understand, what is this that's coming their way? They needed to understand it from an internal process perspective, meaning that how does it impact our budgeting? How does it impact our planning? They needed to understand the risks and the opportunities that people are talking about, whether it be ESG or sustainability or the integrated report. But they needed to figure out, well, how does that link to performance? And even, is there a correlation between strong sustainability performance and the financial impact that it has on your employee engagement or even your recruitment? I think once TELUS saw the benefits, once they started to understand what this is, it made it easier for them to engage other parts of the organization and also to engage the board. But the other thing they did was they also educated their board. They wanted to strengthen the knowledge of the board so that the board could ask the right questions when they did present the ESG information to them. So the board was educated on ESG and they understood the fast, business imperative that was coming their way. And then also the financial implications for the company. But at the end of the day, everybody wants to know what's the impact, right? So those would be some of the tidbits, but I think everything starts to boil down towards education. I would strongly encourage building some type of capacity on understanding what are some of these parameters that are coming our way.
Great, thank you. And Julian, you talked to us earlier about the integrated approach that you've taken and engaging the board on that integrated thinking concept. Was there any sort of processes that you put in place to help to facilitate that?
Probably the key process that we put in place to continue to educate our board members after putting them through a workshop. That only gets you so far, and then if they don't see any real evidence of that thinking coming through, then it's very hard for them to evolve. But the key process we put in place was we came up with a new board template for board papers. And on this template, we try to keep it fairly simple, but within the opening sort of gambit, if you like, at the top, there's a section which basically had our each category of our 6 capitals, and we used icons to sort of point out which capitals were being discussed within the body of the paper. So it wouldn't be all 6 at once, but sometimes it'll be 3 of the capitals are being discussed within this paper. And we found initially we sort of took an iterative approach to this. We used our governance manager because she was effectively the gatekeeper of all the papers that were going to the board, any business cases, any initiatives that were that needed to be discussed. And she was fantastic. She would review the papers, and if there was no evidence of it or no recognition of the capitals, then she would go back to the senior manager who was, or the executive who put it together, and then coach them in terms of how they can reshape that paper so that it does clearly show that integrated thinking. And it was a bit of a journey. I think the first year people were still a bit like put out as to why do I have to rework this paper? It's good enough as it is. But what they found was after reworking it and then sort of moving across this new way of putting together a board paper, they got a lot more buy-in from the board because they were seeing the value coming through. So that if they got 3 board papers through and one of them wasn't showing that, then it would be clearly called out in the meeting, which was again another powerful way to reinforce the move to integrated thinking within the business. So it was a simple tool, but it was a very effective one. And then from that, you could see it find its way, as I mentioned earlier, into procurement plans. And our CFO said, "I'm not signing off any business case unless I can see the capital is clearly discussed within the body of business case. So they're probably the main tools. And again, also what we're doing at the moment is we're looking at our onboarding process at the moment at Watercare, and a big part of that is we're going to have a module dedicated to introducing new staff members to the ideas of integrated thinking, introducing them to our value creation model, introducing them to what the capitals mean for our business. So it's very important at the top, but then also we're trying to make sure that we filter it all the way down through the organisation.
Great, thank you. So even just by using a very simple visual tool, it started to make a real difference and get traction, which is fantastic to hear. We have a question from our audience. So we have a question from Jeffrey. Jeffrey is asking, how did you convince the board on the goals to profit motive to balance with sustainability, especially for speculative investors across the world? So I'm going to assume that question is for you, Julian, but I think probably there's probably insights from all of you.
I would say, again, a lot of it's around, I mean, it wasn't as difficult, if you like, for us as an organisation to and we're already fairly mature in our sustainability reporting, but we're also, but as an organisation, we know out there that the world's changing, and not just, I guess, for institutional investors. I mean, we're a public benefit entity in the utility, so we have a different set of stakeholders. But at the end of the day, they are buying our service, and they rely on us to be the guardians of the resources that we're using. But quite clearly, the environment that certainly New Zealand is in at the moment, and with the government we currently have, they're very focused on ideas of sustainability, reducing climate change, improving the well-being of New Zealand citizens. So I think not just the concept within the constructs of our industry, but within New Zealand as a whole, that you're not going to get any meaningful buy-in with your organisation, or any meaningful buy-in when we want to do a major project, unless we are clearly demonstrating that we are a green-minded organisation. We care about the environment, and that and certainly as in the finance area, we're not actually thinking about ways in which we can demonstrate that we're trying to use our money or invest or raise funding that has good environmental outcomes. I mean, in New Zealand, we're committed to being net zero carbon by 2050, yep. And I think we're also looking to with our New Zealand Treasury's brought in a living standards index to ways in which to measure, how we're going in terms of reducing poverty within New Zealand. So, I'm sort of coming from a different point of view. We're not a publicly listed company. We're not reliant so much on institutional investors investing in us, but at the same time, we have to show that we are moving with the times. Yes. And I think any organisation in New Zealand, any major corporation needs to be on that journey. And again, you have a champion of the board, but we've got the biggest champion right at the top of the country, our Prime Minister, who is really driving this agenda. We're now facing a new set of sustainable disclosures with the climate. The climate-related financial disclosures regime, which the government has made mandatory for a number of organisations in New Zealand, mainly financial institutions.
Yeah, fantastic, thank you. And I think we've maybe got time to sneak in one final word from you, Robin, if we can manage to keep it very short, because I know Elizabeth wants to close with some final messages. But as our resident board member on this panel, how do you see the evolving regulatory and investor landscape around ESG? How do you think that's going to impact directors' duties and liabilities going forward?
So it is already impacting it. I think it has significantly raised the awareness, because it starts to talk to that fundamental point about what is my liability on the board. Am I aware of all these factors? And I'd go back to very briefly to Jeffrey's question there. For a publicly listed company, I think it's all about credibility always with investors, but more and more of the investors are also now accepting that this is not a nice to have, it's not an add-on, this is fundamental, and they require more transparency on it. Whether or not they choose to invest is another matter, but they are requiring for each publicly listed company more and more information. And that is the responsibility of the board to make sure that that information is given. And I would just tie that up with the fact that I think you can ensure the engagement of the board with this now, not just because the regulator is requiring something, but when they fundamentally understand that this is a business matter and not a reporting matter, and you tie for the executive board, you tie the executive board's remuneration or their bonus somehow to this also. That tends to concentrate the mind a little bit and it gets them engaged because at the end of the day, what gets measured gets done.
Perfect closing words. Thank you very much, Robin. So thank you to all of our speakers, very insightful. I feel we could have gone on for another hour or so hearing a bit more, but we have got to reach the end just now, unfortunately. So Elizabeth, if I can hand over to you to close out the session.
Sure, thank you, Helen, and thank you again to all our speakers. So similarly to what we do at the end of these webinars, I would like to run a call for action poll now. So you see it on your screen. Just give you a moment to do this poll. So how will you translate what you have learned in this webinar to your work in the next 6 months? Great to see many of you will identify ways that you can support engaging the board and also work with relevant departments to prepare for engaging the board as well. Great, thank you very much for your responses. And just a few notices before we close. So as mentioned before, the A4S guide on engaging the board and executive management is in development, but at the A4S Summit in December, we had 2 webinars related to this topic, which would be useful resources for you. So you'll receive links to the webinar recordings and other useful resources in an email afterwards. And the next webinar will be on CapEx, where we will look at embedding sustainability considerations into your capital investment process. And that will be held on the 24th of March at 8 a.m. GMT. And for those of you who are accounting or finance professionals, you may like to consider applying for the A4S Academy. So the 2021 program is now open for applications. And you will find more details in the follow-up email. And finally, as we run these seminars every month, we are keen to get your feedback to help us make these as useful as possible. So please can I ask that you complete a feedback poll before you sign off. Let me just bring that up. And let me just say thank you again to all our speakers and to all who have dialed in today. And we hope to see you again soon. Thank you.